"Please marry my sister, mister. We're starving," begged the little Ojibwe girl. A whisper, barely a breath against the biting wind, shattered the fragile silence of the desolate plains. It was a plea, raw and desperate, an echo of a forgotten age, yet startlingly real in its immediate demand. "Please marry my sister, mister. We're starving." The words, tumbling from a child's lips, carried the weight of a world collapsing, a civilization fraying at its very edges. This isn't just a story of survival. It's a lament for what is lost, and a desperate gamble for what little remains. Before we get into this tale, let us know in the comments, where are you watching from? And subscribe if you want more content like this one. The man, Elias Thorne, stood at the precipice of his own small, hardened world, a solitary figure dwarfed by the immensity of the winter-starved landscape. His breath plumed white against the bitter air, mirroring the cloud that often seemed to perpetually cling to his weary spirit. He had seen hunger before, tasted its metallic tang on his own tongue, but never had it manifested with such stark, unvarnished vulnerability as it did now, personified in the small, trembling girl before him. Her eyes, wide and dark like polished stones, held an ancient wisdom far beyond her years, a silent testament to the cruel lessons etched upon her young heart. Her worn, patched buckskin tunic offered little defense against the relentless chill that clawed at their bones, a chill that promised death with every gust. Elias had been tracing the sparse tracks of a lone rabbit, his mind consumed by the relentless arithmetic of survival, each calorie a victory, each wasted moment a defeat. His rifle, cold and heavy in his gloved hands, felt less like a tool of provision and more like a grim companion on a journey without end. He hadn't noticed them at first, so perfectly did their stillness blend with the muted tones of the desolate scrubland, two figures huddled against the skeletal remains of what might have once been a proud lodge. Then the girl had stepped forward, a wisp of smoke against the vast, indifferent sky, her voice thin but impossibly clear, cutting through the low whine of the wind. Her sister, a shadow behind her, remained silent, wrapped in a threadbare blanket, her face obscured, a mystery Elias had no desire to unravel. He looked at the girl, then past her to the silent, unmoving form, and a shiver, not of cold, but of a profound, disquieting understanding, snaked down his spine. This was not a request. It was a desperate pronouncement, a desperate sacrifice laid bare beneath a sky that offered no comfort, only the promise of more endless, aching days. The words hung in the frigid air, crystallizing into an impossible dilemma that Elias had no will, nor even the capacity to solve. Marry her sister? The sheer audacity of the plea was eclipsed only by its chilling desperation. His life had been a series of calculated retreats, a slow, deliberate shrinking away from entanglement, from responsibility, from the crushing weight of others' needs. Each sunrise he fought for his own meager existence, a solitary war against a world that had long since forgotten the meaning of kindness. What little he possessed, the rifle, a few traps, the meager provisions in his pack, were the hard-won spoils of that isolated battle, not resources to be shared, least of all to be pledged to strangers. He looked at the girl again, her small hand outstretched, not begging for food, but for something far more profound and binding. He saw the faint blue tint beneath her skin, the way her eyes seemed too large for her gaunt face, and a part of him, a part he thought long dead, stirred uneasily. It was a phantom ache, a memory of a time when the world had held more color, more promise, before the frost had crept into everything. He thought of his own past, a landscape of broken promises and self-inflicted wounds, a life lived on the fringes, always just a breath away from the edge. Marriage was a word steeped in commitment, in shared burdens, in a future he had meticulously avoided constructing. He had learned the harsh lesson of relying on no one, and of allowing no one to rely on him. This was a bargain of desperation, a last resort born of unimaginable suffering. And he, Elias Thorne, a man whose only loyalty was to the next meal, was being asked to step into a chasm he had spent a lifetime avoiding. He shifted his weight, the creak of the stiff leather of his coat echoing in the stillness, an unconscious refusal. The wind picked up, swirling dust and frozen leaves around their feet, a silent, indifferent witness to the tableau of human misery. He could offer them a portion of his meager food, perhaps, a temporary reprieve, but to offer his very future, his freedom, it was a price too steep, a sacrifice too profound for a man who had long ago ceased believing in anything beyond the stark reality of hunger and cold. His gaze drifted to the bundled form behind the girl, the sister, still silent, still shrouded, a silent indictment of his own hardened heart. Elias stood frozen, the girl's plea reverberating in his skull. His silence was a shield against the torrent of emotions. Yet, his eyes continued their relentless survey. He saw the way the sister, Naomi, even huddled, seemed to absorb the cold, her form too rigid, too unyielding. He noticed the minute tremors in the girl's outstretched hand, not from the chill but profound weakness. The silence stretched, taut and brittle like ancient ice, until the girl, Kiyomi, spoke again, her voice thin but unwavering. "She's good. She can work. She's strong." It was a desperate sales pitch, stripped bare of pretense, a stark declaration of utility over dignity, a chilling echo of a world where human value was measured only by labor. Elias recalled a memory, sharp and sudden, of a different kind of selling, years ago, in a muddy makeshift town on the edges of the mining camps. A woman, thin and pale, her eyes hollowed by want, offering a child's toy for a handful of flour. The desperate glint in her eye, the quiet shame that burned beneath the surface. It was the same light he saw now in Kiyomi's gaze. He had walked away then, quickening his pace, his stomach churning with an unnameable dread, a refusal to bear witness to such raw human pain. He had told himself it wasn't his burden, that he had his own battles, but the image haunted him, a ghostly presence in the quiet nights, a testament to the world's inescapable cruelty. Now here it was again, laid bare on the frozen earth. He saw the faint, desperate flutter of life clinging to these two women, a flicker against the encroaching darkness. He saw not a choice, but an inevitability, a slow, agonizing descent. The sister shifted, a barely perceptible movement, and Elias caught a glimpse of her face, partially revealed. Her eyes, dark and ancient, met his, and in their depths he saw not pleading but a resigned despair, a quiet understanding of the desperate bargain being offered. It was a gaze that spoke of enduring hardship, of witnessing too much, of a spirit tempered by fire and ice yet still unbroken. A strange, unwelcome recognition flickered within him. He saw a kindred spirit, perhaps, in the deep-seated weariness that shadowed her features, a reflection of his own soul's desolate landscape. The wind howled, a mournful dirge for all that was lost and for all that might never be. Elias took a slow, deliberate breath, the cold air burning his lungs. His gaze lingered on Naomi's eyes, those pools of ancient sorrow, which held no flicker of hope, only the bleak recognition of their predicament. What exactly would I gain from this bargain? His voice was a rasp, unused to forming questions that involved anything beyond his immediate survival. It was a test, a brutal query designed to strip away any remaining pretense, to lay bare the transactional core of their desperate exchange. Kiyomi, quick and sharp, interjected before her sister could speak. "She knows the land. She knows the medicines. She can stitch, she can mend, she can make fire even when the wood is wet." Each declaration was a desperate attempt to elevate her sister's worth, a child's fervent belief in the pricelessness of her kin, yet also a chilling reminder of the stark necessities of their world. Naomi remained silent, her gaze fixed on some distant, invisible point beyond Elias, her posture radiating a profound weariness that settled deep into the landscape itself. She was a woman resigned to her fate, yet not broken by it, a willow bending in the storm, not snapping. Elias, however, saw beyond the child's earnest declarations. He saw the impossible weight of responsibility, the inevitable entanglement. He saw the hungry mouths, the vulnerability, the potential for yet another bond to be forged only to be severed by the indifferent hand of fate. His own life had been shaped by a similar cutting, a sudden, irreversible tear that left a gaping hole where warmth and belonging once resided. He had learned to move through the world unburdened, unattached, a phantom in the desolate expanse. But the girl's plea, the sister's quiet despair, gnawed at something long buried within him. an unwelcome echo of a past he had painstakingly tried to forget. He considered the sheer audacity of the idea, to take a wife not for love, not for companionship, but for survival. A cold, calculated transaction under the merciless gaze of a dying sun. The thought was bitter, yet strangely compelling in its brutal honesty. He had nothing to lose, perhaps, but his carefully constructed solitude, and for a fleeting moment, even that seemed a lesser burden than the silent accusation in Kiyomi's pleading eyes. The wind whispered, carrying the distant promise of deeper snow, a silent clock counting down the precious hours they had left. The silence in the makeshift shelter was a palpable presence, thicker and colder than the thin winter air seeping through the gaps in the branches. Elias had led them, not back to his own hidden lean-to, but to a slightly larger abandoned trapper's hut he knew of, a silent testament to someone else's failed dreams. It offered minimal refuge, but it was better than the exposed wilderness. Naomi moved with a quiet efficiency that Elias found both unsettling and grudgingly admirable. She gathered dried wood with deliberate movements, her hands raw and chapped, yet she didn't complain. Kiyomi, once she had warmed her small hands by the meager fire, seemed to cling to her sister's side, her eyes darting between Naomi and Elias, a silent sentinel of their new, fragile arrangement. Elias watched them from the periphery of his vision, a hunter observing unfamiliar prey. He found himself dissecting their every movement, searching for signs of deceit, of weakness, of anything that might justify his initial, unwavering cynicism. He saw instead a quiet resilience, a profound adaptability that was almost frightening in its depth. The way Naomi meticulously cleaned the meager portion of squirrel he had managed to trap, her movements practiced and fluid, spoke of a life spent in intimate communion with the earth, a stark contrast to his own more brutal, less respectful methods. He offered no words, and she asked none. Their dialogue was conducted through the precise language of necessity, the sharing of a knife, the silent exchange of firewood, the quiet crackle of the flames. It was a marriage born of desperation, devoid of ceremony or affection, a silent contract etched not on paper, but on the frozen landscape of their shared survival. Yet, a peculiar tension simmered beneath the surface, a mixture of mistrust and a strange, nascent curiosity. Elias felt the weight of their gaze upon him, even when they weren't looking directly, a constant pressure on his carefully guarded solitude. He was no longer just a solitary hunter. He was a provider, a reluctant protector, a husband in name only, yet bound by an invisible thread to these two women whose lives he had, in a single desperate moment, intertwined with his own. The wind outside wailed, a mournful lament, and inside the fire cast dancing shadows, painting their stark new reality on the rough-hewn walls of the forgotten hut. Days bled into weeks, each one a relentless cycle of hunger and cold, yet within the confines of the decrepit hut, a strange, hesitant rhythm began to emerge. Elias found himself observing Naomi more closely, seeing beyond the initial shroud of desperation. Her silence was not empty. It was a deep well of unspoken understanding, a quiet strength beneath her weary exterior. She knew the names of plants, even dormant, pointing out subtle signs of winter berries hidden beneath snow, identifying roots that could ward off illness. She hummed low, ancient melodies, songs that spoke of rolling plains and whispering pines, of a world Elias knew only as a resource, never a home. One afternoon, as he watched her mend a tear in Kiyomi's small moccasin with a practiced hand, a memory surfaced, unbidden and sharp as broken glass. He saw a woman's face, not Naomi's, but another, long-lost face framed by soft brown hair, her hands gentle as she stitched a worn blanket by firelight. Ilara. Her name was a whisper in the wind, a ghost that had haunted his dreams for years. They had planned a life, a small cabin by a clear river, a future woven with threads of shared dreams. But then the fever had come, swift and merciless, sweeping through the scattered settlements like a vengeful spirit, taking her in its unforgiving embrace. He had watched her fade, helpless, powerless, his hands clenched around her cold ones, unable to halt death. He had cursed the sky himself, the fragile, fleeting nature of human connection. That raw grief had calcified into an unyielding cynicism, a fear of vulnerability that had driven him into the solitary wilderness, exiled from the possibility of pain. Now, watching Naomi's quiet strength, the echo of Alara's touch rippled across the years. It wasn't romantic longing, but a recognition of shared loss, a faint stir of empathy for the burdens she carried, for the world that had stolen so much from her, as it had from him. The bitter cold outside seemed to deepen, but inside the hut, a tiny, almost imperceptible shift occurred, a thawing of the ice that had encased Elias's heart for far too long. He saw not just a survivalist partner, but a human being, resilient and scarred, weathering her own silent storm. The fragile peace within their small, isolated world was abruptly shattered by the arrival of the trappers. Elias had known they were out there, always lurking, coveting the beaver pelts and the deer herds he painstakingly tracked, but their presence had remained distant, a shadow at the edge of his awareness. Now, they were here, 3 men, their faces weathered and suspicious, their eyes hard as flint, embodying the raw, unrefined greed that often festered in the desolate corners of the land. They brought with them the acrid scent of cheap tobacco and unwashed wool, and a palpable air of malevolence that seemed to curdle the already thin air. One, a hulking brute named Silas with a scarred cheek and a laugh like grinding stones, leered at Naomi from the doorway, his gaze lingering. "Well, Thorn," Silas drawled, his voice thick with malicious amusement, "seems you finally found yourself a squaw. Heard you were too much of a loner for such comforts." His words were a barbed hook, designed to wound, to challenge Elias's carefully cultivated reputation as an untamed spirit, untouchable by the conventions of man. The racial slur hung in the air, thick and repulsive, a stark reminder of societal biases clinging to this harsh existence. Elias felt a cold fury, unfamiliar and potent, surge through him. It was an instinctive, primal urge to protect, born not of obligation, but of a surprising, unacknowledged connection to Naomi and Kiyomi. He had spent years avoiding confrontation, navigating the wilderness like a phantom, but now, faced with this overt threat, something within him snapped into focus. His hand instinctively went to the rifle resting against the rough-hewn wall. Kiyomi, sensing the shift in the air, shrank back behind Naomi, her small hands clutching her sister's buckskin dress. Naomi, however, stood her ground, her face a mask of weary defiance, her dark eyes meeting Silas's leer with a quiet, unwavering strength that seemed to surprise even the hulking trapper. This was their struggle, layered over Elias's own, a silent battle for dignity and survival against the encroaching darkness of human cruelty. The stakes had suddenly escalated beyond mere hunger. They now encompassed something far more precious, far more vulnerable. The desolate wilderness, once a sanctuary, now felt like a cage, and the predators were circling. Elias's grip tightened on his rifle, knuckles white. The hut's air crackled with unspoken challenge, a silent standoff between encroaching threat and his burgeoning resolve. He looked at Silas, then back at Naomi, whose quiet dignity in the face of such raw contempt solidified something within him. This was not just about protecting his own existence. This was about something larger, something he hadn't known he still possessed. Righteous indignation, a flicker of humanity's better instincts. "They're with me," Elias stated, his voice low and dangerous, each word a stone dropped into a deep well, echoing with finality. "And you'll leave them be." There was no room for negotiation, no quarter offered. The trappers exchanged glances, surprise flickering in their eyes. Elias Thorn was known for his elusive nature, his indifference, never for standing his ground in defense of another, least of all a native woman. Silas, though, scoffed, a sneer twisting his scarred mouth. "Or what, Thorn? You gonna let your little squaw fight your battles now?" It was a provocation, a blatant attempt to strip Elias of his perceived masculinity, to force him into a more brutal, public display of power. But Elias did not fall for the bait. Instead, he simply raised his rifle, slowly, deliberately, the barrel glinting dully in the dim light, aiming not at Silas's chest, but at the empty space above his head. The message was clear. The next one wouldn't miss. A tremor of unease rippled through the trappers. They were bullies, not martyrs. The silent threat, delivered with calm, unwavering certainty, was more effective than any boast. Silas's sneer faltered, replaced by a grudging respect, or perhaps simply fear. "All right, Thorn," he muttered, his voice devoid of its earlier bravado. "No need to get all riled up, just passing through." He backed away, his companions following, their heavy boots scuffing the frozen ground, leaving behind only the lingering stench of their malice. The hut was silent again, the tension slowly dissipating, leaving behind a profound stillness. Elias lowered his rifle, his gaze falling upon Naomi. She looked at him, her dark eyes searching his, and in them he saw not gratitude, but a deeper, more profound understanding, a silent acknowledgement of the unspoken vows they had just exchanged in the face of danger. He had chosen, and in that choice, a piece of his hardened heart had undeniably begun to heal. The trapper's departure left a hollow silence, a vacuum slowly filled by fire's crackle and wind's distant whine. Elias sat, rifle across his lap, gaze fixed on the dancing flames, but his mind replayed the confrontation, dissecting his unexpected reaction. He had acted instinctively, without thought for his own safety, a stark deviation from years of constructed isolation. Naomi moved closer, quiet footsteps barely disturbing the air, and sat opposite him, her presence a warm, grounding force in the dim hut. Naomi had long since fallen asleep, curled in a small ball by the fire, oblivious to the fragile truce that had just been forged. "Why?" Naomi's voice was a soft murmur, barely audible above the wind's low moan, but it cut through Elias's thoughts with the sharpness of a honed blade. It wasn't a question born of curiosity, but of a deep need for understanding, a quiet challenge to their reluctant union's foundation. Elias looked at her, truly, for the first time without cynicism or desperation. He saw the faint scars on her hands, the lines of worry etched around her eyes, the quiet strength that had weathered unimaginable storms. And in that moment, the carefully constructed walls around his heart crumbled, not violently, but with the slow, almost imperceptible grace of melting ice. I saw myself," he admitted, the words rough and unpracticed, stumbling from his lips like stones from a dry riverbed. "Lost, alone, desperate." He didn't elaborate, didn't speak of Alara, of the fever, of the raw, bleeding wound that had driven him into exile. He didn't have to. Naomi's gaze held profound understanding, an empathy that transcended words. She knew loss, desperation, what it was to be utterly alone in a world that sought to consume you. "We are not so different, you and I," she whispered, her voice laced with a quiet sorrow, but also a nascent connection. It was a revelation, a stripping bare of pretense, a mutual acknowledgement of shared humanity in the face of a cruel, indifferent world. The air between them, once thick with unspoken tension, now hummed with a fragile, burgeoning warmth, a promise born of shared vulnerability and unexpected courage. Elias reached out hesitantly and took her hand. It was rough, calloused, but warm against his own. A silent, profound vow passed between them, one not of convenience but of mutual recognition, of a fragile, hard-won hope. The marriage, born of hunger, was finally beginning to truly exist. The harsh grip of winter eventually loosened, slowly giving way to the tentative whispers of spring. The snows began to recede, revealing the starved earth beneath, patches of vibrant green emerging with tenacious defiance. Elias and Naomi, and little Kiyomi, survived. They had done more than just endure the biting cold and the gnawing hunger. They had forged something new and unexpected in the crucible of shared adversity. Their bond, once a cold, transactional necessity, had deepened into a complex tapestry woven with threads of quiet respect, unspoken understanding, and a profound, nascent affection. Elias still spoke little, his words as sparse as the winter landscape he knew so well, but his actions now spoke volumes. He hunted with a renewed purpose, no longer just for himself, but for the small, fragile family he had reluctantly, then fiercely, claimed. He taught Kiyomi how to track small game, her laughter echoing in the newly greening forests, a sound that pierced the long-held silence of his heart. Naomi, in turn, showed him the deeper secrets of the land, the forgotten ways of healing and sustenance, the profound interconnectedness of all living things. Their differences remained stark and undeniable, a testament to their disparate worlds and painful histories. Yet, they had found a common ground, a place where their individual scars could slowly, painstakingly begin to mend, not in isolation, but in the shared warmth of a fragile, hard-won companionship. The future remained uncertain, as it always did in this unforgiving land. There would be more challenges, more winters, more whispers of old prejudices. But Elias was no longer the lone wolf, forever retreating into the shadows. He had found a reason to stand, to fight, to build, however tentatively, a future not for himself alone, but for the two women who had, with a desperate plea and a quiet dignity, cracked open the hardened shell of his heart. The echoes of Kiyomi's desperate plea, "Please marry my sister, mister, we're starving," would forever remain a solemn reminder of their impossible beginning. But now, in the vibrant blush of spring, that initial agony had given way to a quiet, enduring promise. It was not a happy ending in the traditional sense, for the world was still harsh and unforgiving, but it was an ending imbued with hope, a testament to the enduring power of human connection, even when born from the bleakest of circumstances, even when everything seemed lost.